Name every CEO in this room, and $1 million is yours, the billionaire said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, cutting clean through the hum of crystal glasses and polite laughter. And for a moment, the entire ballroom of the Hawthorne Grand in Manhattan seemed to lean in, waiting for someone bold or foolish enough to try. But no one moved, not the seasoned executives in tailored suits, not the women in silk gowns shimmering under the chandelier light, not even the young analysts, hovering near the edges hoping to be noticed. And then from the far corner of the room, where the light barely reached past a marble column, a small voice answered, "Okay," and it didn't rise above the music so much as slip between the notes. Yet somehow it landed heavier than anything that had been said all night, because when heads turned, they didn't find confidence wrapped in designer labels. They found a little black girl standing alone with a worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. Her sneakers scuffed, her braids neatly tied but slightly frayed at the ends, and for a second, confusion rippled through the crowd like a silent question no one wanted to ask out loud. How did she get in here? But she didn't flinch under their stares, didn't step back when a security guard near the entrance shifted his weight, waiting for a signal. Instead, she took one small step forward onto the polished floor, the soft squeak of her shoe echoing louder than it should have in a room built for power. And somewhere near the front, Richard Hawthorne, the man who had built an empire out of precision and control, tilted his head ever so slightly, studying her as if she were an unexpected variable in a system that never failed, his lips curling into something that almost looked like amusement. "You?" he said, not unkind, but not kind either, just curious in the way powerful men are when something disrupts their script, and a few guests chuckled, low and contained, the kind of laughter that hides behind champagne flutes. But the girl didn't smile, didn't shrink. She simply adjusted the strap of her backpack and walked further into the light until it caught her face fully, revealing eyes that were far too steady for someone her age, eyes that didn't dart or plead or hesitate, eyes that seemed to be measuring the room instead of fearing it. And as she stopped at the center of the ballroom, directly beneath the chandelier, where light fractured into 1,000 tiny reflections around her, the music softened, not because anyone told it to, but because the room itself had begun to hold its breath, and Richard set his glass down with a quiet click that carried farther than the orchestra. "You understand the game?" he asked, his tone now edged with interest, and she nodded once, slow and certain. "Name them all," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the words rather than the challenge itself. And for the first time that evening, something flickered behind Richard's composed expression, something brief and unreadable, because this wasn't how these moments usually went, not in rooms like this, not with stakes like these. And yet there she stood, a child in a place built for titans, and somehow she looked less out of place than the silence that followed her. And when she lifted her gaze and let it move across the faces in front of her, one by one, deliberate, unhurried, it didn't feel like she was searching, it felt like she was remembering. And that was the moment the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the second before a storm breaks, because suddenly the question wasn't whether she could do it, it was how she already knew where to begin. A soft ripple of laughter lingered at the edges of the room, uncertain now, like it no longer knew where it belonged, and the security guard who had taken a step forward paused mid-motion, glancing toward Richard for instruction that never came, because Richard Hawthorne had not moved, not even an inch, his eyes fixed on the girl, as if recalculating something he had already solved. And the orchestra, sensing the shift, let the final notes of their piece fade into a thin, suspended silence, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of glass from another hall. And in that stillness, the girl took a breath, small but steady, and spoke. "That is Daniel Mercer, Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Logistics." Her voice clear, not loud, but placed with precision, and a man near the front stiffened, his smile tightening as heads turned toward him, some impressed, others merely curious. And before anyone could react, she continued, her gaze already moving. "Next to him is Alana Ruiz, founder of Ruiz Biotech." And a woman in a silver gown blinked, startled, her hand freezing halfway to her glass. And now the laughter was gone completely, replaced by something sharper, something that listened, and the girl did not rush. She did not stumble. She moved through the room with her eyes the way a reader moves across a page she already understands. James Holloway, Holloway Capital, she said, and a man near the back straightened unconsciously. Victor Lang, Lang Industries, and each name landed like a quiet tap against glass, steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and with each one, the air grew heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new center of gravity, and Richard's fingers, resting lightly against the table, curled just slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to betray that something inside his carefully constructed calm had shifted, and still she continued. You restructured your workforce last year, she added softly, not accusing, not emotional, just stating, and Daniel Mercer's expression flickered, the kind of flicker that only people watching closely would catch, and a murmur passed through a few guests, quickly suppressed, and now the pattern was breaking, because this was no longer a game of names. This was something else, something that reached just beneath the surface of polished reputations. And the girl's voice did not change, it remained. Even almost gentle, Alana Ruiz expanded into clinical trials in Texas, she said, and Alana's lips parted slightly, surprise slipping through her composure, and somewhere near the back, a phone lowered, forgotten, because no one wanted to miss what came next, and the girl paused for the first time, just a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning again, not searching, but choosing, and when she spoke again, the room leaned closer without meaning to. James Holloway, she repeated, you closed your Chicago office in March, and now the silence was complete, absolute, the kind that feels like it is weight, and Richard straightened slowly, not abruptly, but with intention, as if he had decided that standing would give him a better view of what was unfolding, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier amusement. Who told you this? He asked. And the question did not sound like a challenge anymore. It sounded like a door opening to something he did not expect, and the girl finally looked at him fully, meeting his gaze without hesitation. And for a moment, just a moment, the entire room seemed to disappear around them, leaving only the space between a man who controlled everything and a child who clearly did not need permission to continue. And then she said, simply, no one, and turned her attention back to the room, as if that answer was enough, as if the truth did not require explanation, and that was the moment when the last trace of doubt slipped away, replaced by something far more unsettling, because it was no longer possible to pretend this was luck or coincidence or a clever trick. This was knowledge, and knowledge, in a room like this, was power. The word no one lingered in the air long after she said it, simple and unshaken. And for the first time that night, the confidence in a room began to fracture in ways too subtle for applause, but too real to ignore. Because these were people who built fortunes on knowing things before others did, on controlling information, shaping it, burying it when necessary. And yet here stood a child who spoke as if none of those barriers had ever existed. And as her gaze moved again, slow and deliberate, it became clear that she was not finished, not even close. Eleanor Price, Price Energy, she said, her tone unchanged, and a woman near the center straightened slightly, her expression tightening, as if she had just been called into a meeting she did not prepare for. You announced your expansion last quarter, the girl added, not accusatory, just precise, and a few heads turned again, sharper this time, because now there was a pattern no one could ignore. This was not memorization. This was something deeper, something connected. And the girl shifted her weight gently, the strap of her backpack brushing against her shoulder as she continued. Michael Trent, Trent Holdings, and a man near the bar lowered his drink slowly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in anger, but in calculation, the same calculation that defined rooms like this. And yet he said nothing, because what could he say? And somewhere behind him, a woman whispered something under her breath, quickly silenced by the weight of the moment, and the girl's voice carried on, steady as a metronome. Your company acquired 3 smaller firms in the Midwest, she said, and Michael Trent's jaw shifted, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm that she was not guessing, and that was when the room changed again, not louder, not softer, but heavier, as if every person present had suddenly become aware of how visible they truly were. And Richard Hawthorne watched it happen, watched the subtle tension ripple through people who were never supposed to feel exposed. And something inside him, something old and carefully managed, began to stir, because this was not just a challenge anymore. This was a disruption, and disruptions, he knew better than anyone, had consequences, and still she continued. "Harold Stein Financial," she said. And an older man near the back blinked in surprise, his hand tightening slightly around his cane, and the girl paused again, just long enough to let the silence settle before adding, "You stepped down last year, but you are still on the board." And a quiet murmur slipped through the crowd, softer now, almost reluctant, because acknowledging what was happening meant admitting that control had shifted, even if only for a moment. And the girl did not smile, did not acknowledge the reaction. She simply kept going, one name after another, each one placed with the same calm certainty, until the room itself seemed to narrow, not physically, but in focus, until every face, every breath, every subtle movement pointed back to her. And then, without warning, she stopped, her eyes lifting slightly, moving across the room one more time before settling. Not on a group, not on a section, but on a single person, and it was not one of the executives she had already named. It was the man who had started it all, Richard Hawthorne. And for the first time since she began, she did not speak immediately. And that pause, that single quiet pause, carried more weight than any name she had said so far, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. There was only one name left. And as the silence stretched, long enough to feel intentional, Richard met her gaze fully, no longer amused, no longer distant, but present in a way he had not expected, and the room held its breath once more, waiting, not for the end of the game, but for whatever truth was about to follow his name. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the ballroom, like a held breath that no one dared release, and Richard Hawthorne felt it settle around him in a way he had not experienced in years. Not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not even in moments where billions of dollars hung in the balance, because this was different. This was not about numbers or leverage. This was about being seen. And as the girl stood there beneath the chandelier, her small frame steady in the glow of 1,000 lights, she did not look intimidated. She looked certain, and that certainty was what unsettled him most. "Go on," he said finally, his voice measured, controlled, but quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and somewhere behind him, a glass was set down too quickly, the faint sound echoing through the stillness, and the girl tilted her head just slightly, as if acknowledging the invitation, or perhaps the inevitability of what came next. And then she spoke, Richard Hawthorne. She said, his name landing differently than the others, heavier, more deliberate, and a subtle shift passed through the room. Not surprise, because of course she would know his name, but anticipation, because everyone sensed that this was not the end of the pattern. This was the beginning of something else, and she did not stop there. Founder and chief executive officer of Hawthorne Industries, she continued, her voice calm, almost gentle, and Richard gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, a reflex, but his eyes did not leave her face, because something in her tone had changed, not in volume, not in pace, but in direction. And then she took one step closer, just enough to close the distance without breaking the invisible boundary between them, and said, "You started your company 12 years ago," and a few guests exchanged glances, unsure why such a well-known fact felt suddenly important. "In a small office in Charleston," she added, and Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, because that detail, while not secret, was not the kind of thing people in this room usually mentioned. "Not here, not like this," and the girl continued, her eyes steady on his. "You said once that you built everything from nothing." And now the room leaned in again, drawn by the shift they could feel but not yet name. And Richard let out a slow breath, his posture still composed, but something behind it had begun to move, something quieter, less certain, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might respond, might redirect, might reclaim the space he had created. But before he could, The girl spoke again, softer this time, but somehow clearer than before. "But that is not the whole story," she said, and the words did not accuse, they revealed. And a ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, because now this was no longer a game, no longer a clever display of knowledge. This was a line being drawn, and Richard's fingers, resting at his side, curled slightly as he studied her, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would restore the balance he understood. But there was none, only that same steady gaze, that same quiet certainty, and the girl reached into her backpack slowly, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and pulled out a small, worn photograph, its edges softened with time, and held it in both hands, not raising it high, not displaying it to the room, but simply holding it as if it belonged to the moment. And for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the air itself seemed to shift again, this time deeper, heavier, like the first drop of rain before a storm, and Richard's eyes flickered just once to the photograph, then back to her face, and something inside him, something he had long ago placed in a corner and locked away, stirred, with a quiet, unmistakable force. And when she finally spoke again, her voice did not rise, did not break. It remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, steady, clear, unafraid. "You forgot to mention who helped you start," she said, and the room, for the third time that night, fell into a silence that felt entirely new. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one could ignore. And for the first time that night, no one looked at the girl as an interruption or a curiosity. They looked at her as something else entirely, something that did not belong to the script they all understood. And Richard Hawthorne felt it most of all, not in the room, but somewhere deeper, somewhere behind the calm exterior he had spent years perfecting. Because the moment she said it, something old shifted, something he had not allowed himself to revisit. And his voice, when it came, was slower now, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. "What are you talking about?" he asked, not dismissive, not mocking, but controlled, as if the answer might matter more than he wanted it to. And the girl did not react to the question with hesitation or fear. She simply looked down at the photograph in her hands for a brief moment, her fingers brushing lightly against its worn edges, as if grounding herself in something steady. And then she looked back up, meeting his eyes again. "You said you built everything on your own," she repeated softly, and a few people in the crowd shifted, uncomfortable now because they recognized the tone, not confrontational, but undeniable, the kind of tone that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And Richard exhaled slowly, his posture still upright, still composed, but the air around him had changed, tightened, and the girl continued, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. "But someone believed in you first," she said, and a faint murmur passed through the edges of the room, quickly silenced because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. And Richard's gaze dropped again, just for a fraction of a second, to the photograph. And this time, he did not look away as quickly, because something about it, something about the way she held it, felt familiar in a way that did not make sense. And the girl took another small step forward, not aggressive, not demanding, just closer, enough that the light caught the photograph more clearly, though she still did not raise it for the room to see. "Someone helped you when no one else would," she added, and now the silence felt heavier, more intentional, as if the room itself understood that this was no longer about business or reputation. This was about something personal, something real. And Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest sign of tension, but enough for those watching closely to notice, and he straightened just a bit more, as if reclaiming control through posture alone. "There are a lot of people who helped along the way," he said, his tone even, practiced, the kind of answer that had served him well in interviews and speeches. But the girl did not nod, did not accept it. She simply held his gaze, steady and unwavering. And for a moment, it was clear that she had expected that response, that she had heard it before, perhaps in a different form. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow it carried even further. "Not like her," she said, and this time, something in Richard's expression shifted in a way that could not be hidden. Not fully, because the certainty in her voice had crossed into something else, something specific, and the room felt it. That shift from general truth to something deeply personal, and Richard's eyes flickered again to the photograph, lingering just a second longer, as if trying to place it, to recognize what his instinct were already beginning to understand. And the girl finally lifted it slightly, not high, not for the crowd, but just enough for him to see clearly, and though the room could not make out the details, they could see the moment it registered, the way Richard's breath paused, the way his expression stilled, not frozen, but caught between recognition and disbelief, and in that quiet, suspended second, the balance of the entire room shifted again, because the man who had controlled everything since the moment he walked in was no longer the one guiding what happened next. And the girl, still holding the photograph with both hands, spoke one more time, her voice steady, unshaken, and impossible to ignore. "Do you remember her?" Now, the question did not echo. It settled, quiet and deliberate. And for a moment that felt longer than it was, Richard Hawthorne did not answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because something inside him had already begun to respond before his voice could catch up, and the photograph in the girl's hands was no longer just an object. It was a doorway, one he had closed years ago with careful precision, and now, standing under the same chandelier that had reflected his success only minutes. Earlier, he found himself staring at something that did not belong to this room, something that belonged to a different version of himself. And his breath slowed, not controlled, not measured, just slower as his eyes fixed on the image, and the room, sensing the shift, remained still, not out of politeness, but because no one knew how to move without breaking whatever was happening. And the girl did not rush him, did not repeat the question. She simply waited, her posture unchanged, her hands steady around the photograph, as if she understood that some answers could not be forced. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had heard it all night. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and it was not a deflection. It was a genuine question, one that carried more weight than any command he had given before. And the girl tilted her head slightly, her expression softening just a fraction, not with sympathy, but with certainty. "She kept it," she said, and the simplicity of the answer landed deeper than anything else, because it implied something he had not allowed himself to consider, not in years. And Richard's gaze dropped again to the photograph, this time longer, and though no one else could see it clearly, he could. The faint outline of a small office, the old desk, the papers, scattered in a way that only early ambition could justify, and beside him, younger, less certain, stood a woman with a quiet smile and eyes that believed in something before it existed, and his fingers moved slightly at his side, as if remembering something they had once held, and the girl took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough that the photograph no longer felt like something far away, but something present, something undeniable. And she spoke again, her voice steady, but softer now. "You said you had nothing," she said, and Richard did not look up because he already knew where she was going. "But she gave you something," she continued, and a subtle shift passed through the room again. Not curiosity now, but understanding, the kind that comes when a story begins to reveal its truth. And Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. And when he finally lifted his eyes back to the girl, there was something different there, something less guarded, less distant. "That was a long time ago," he said, and the words were not dismissive. They were heavy, weighted with the years he had placed between then and now. And the girl nodded once, as if she had expected that too. And for the first time since she had spoken, there was a hint of something else in her expression, not doubt, not hesitation, but something closer to resolve, and she held the photograph a little tighter, her small fingers pressing gently against its edges. "Not for her," she said, and the words did not rise, did not accuse. They simply existed, clear and unshaken. And in that moment, something inside Richard shifted again, deeper this time, because the distance he had relied on, the years, the success, the narrative he had built, all of it felt suddenly thinner, less certain, and the room felt it too. That quiet unraveling, that subtle change in balance, because the man who had started the night with a challenge now stood facing something he could not control, and the girl, still standing in the center of it all, looked at him not as a stranger, not as a billionaire, but as someone who had once been something else, and then she asked, gently, but without hesitation, "Do you remember what you promised her?" The question did not just linger. It reached into something Richard had buried beneath years of success and certainty. And for the first time since the night began, he did not look like the man who controlled the room. He looked like someone searching for something he had not expected to find, and his eyes dropped once more to the photograph. But this time they did not just see it, they recognized it fully, unmistakably, and his voice, when it came, was no longer measured for the audience. It was quieter, almost distant. "I made a lot of promises back then," he said, but even as the words left him, they felt incomplete, like an answer that did not quite reach the truth, and the girl did not interrupt, did not challenge him immediately. She simply held his gaze, steady and patient, as if she understood that he needed to arrive there on his own, and the room remained still, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to break the fragile tension that had replaced the earlier confidence. And then Richard's expression shifted again, more clearly this time, as if a specific memory had surfaced, one he could not push aside, and his shoulders lowered just slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition. "She believed I could build something," he said slowly, the words forming more carefully now. "Even when there was nothing to prove it," and a faint murmur moved through the edges of the crowd, softer than before, almost respectful, because they were no longer watching a spectacle. They were witnessing something real, and the girl nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, encouraging him forward without saying a word, and Richard let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. "I told her that if it worked," he continued, his voice quieter. Now, stripped of the confidence that had filled it earlier, "I would come back," and the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the meaning of that promise was clear enough on its own, and the girl took another step closer, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier. And she lifted the photograph slightly again, not for the crowd, only for him. "You did not," she said, and her voice did not accuse, did not rise. It simply stated what was already known, and Richard closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in acknowledgement, because there was no argument to offer, no explanation that would change the truth of it. And when he opened them again, there was something different there, something that had not been present at any point that evening, something unguarded, and the room felt it, that subtle but undeniable shift. Because the man who had started the night with control now stood in a moment he could not shape, and the girl, still steady, still calm, looked at him with the same unwavering gaze she had held from the beginning. And for the first time, her voice carried something else, not just certainty, but meaning. "She waited," she said, and the words landed deeper than anything before them, because they were not just about the past, they were about time, about absence, about something that had stretched far beyond a single promise. And Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in the quiet weight of understanding, and the girl's fingers tightened gently around the photograph as she spoke one more time, softer now, but clearer than ever. "She told me you would come back when you made it." And the room, once filled with power and certainty, stood completely still, because now the story was no longer about a challenge. It was about a promise that had never been kept. The words hung in the air like something fragile and irreversible, and for a long moment, Richard Hawthorne did not move, did not speak, as if the entire weight of what had just been said had settled somewhere deep enough that it could not be answered quickly. And the room, once filled with quiet confidence and controlled laughter, now felt entirely different, not tense in the way of business negotiations, but still in a way that felt almost reverent, because everyone present understood that something had shifted beyond money, beyond status, beyond the carefully constructed image that defined a man like Richard Hawthorne. And the girl stood there, unchanged, her small frame steady beneath the chandelier, her hand still holding the photograph as if it were both proof and memory at the same time, and she did not rush him, did not fill the silence, because she did not need to. And Richard's gaze lowered again, slower now, more deliberate, as if he were no longer avoiding what he saw, but facing it fully. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the authority it had at the beginning of the night. Only something quieter, something closer to truth. "I thought she moved on," he said, and the words sounded less like an explanation and more like a realization. Something he had told himself for years now, being spoken aloud for the first time, and a faint shift passed through the crowd. Not judgment, not sympathy, just understanding that the story they were witnessing was no longer about a billionaire and a challenge. It was about something unfinished. And the girl listened, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp, as if weighing every word he said. And she shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, but correcting the space between what he believed and what had actually happened. "She stayed," she said softly, and the simplicity of the words made them land harder than anything else, because there was no complexity in them, no room to reinterpret, just a truth that had waited quietly until now. And Richard's breath caught, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to show that something inside him had shifted again, deeper. This time, and he looked at her, really looked, not at her clothes, not at her presence in the room, but at her, as if trying to understand something he had missed from the beginning. And then his gaze returned to the photograph. And this time he reached out, slowly, not with the authority of someone taking something, but with the hesitation of someone asking without words. And the girl watched him for a moment before loosening her grip just enough for him to take it. And when the photograph passed into his hands, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of suspense, but because everyone could feel that this moment mattered in a way that could not be undone. And Richard looked down at it, his fingers steady but slower now, tracing the edges lightly, and whatever distance he had placed between himself and that memory began to close, piece by piece, until it was no longer something abstract. It was real again, present, undeniable. And when he spoke next, his voice was almost a whisper, but it carried across the room with perfect clarity. "She waited for me," he said, and it was not a question, not a guess, but a realization finally spoken aloud. And the girl nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face, and for the first time since she had stepped into the light, there was something else in her expression, not just certainty, but something softer, something that acknowledged what this moment meant. And then she spoke, her voice steady, but now carrying the quiet weight of everything that had led here. "She told me to find you if you ever forgot," she said, and the words settled into the room with a finality that made everything before them feel like preparation, because now there was no distance left, no illusion to hide behind, only the truth standing between them. And Richard, still holding the photograph, lifted his eyes to meet hers again, and in that moment, the balance of the entire room shifted one last time, because the most powerful man in the room was no longer the one asking the questions. He was the one finally ready to hear the answer. The room did not return to noise. It remained suspended in that quiet space where something irreversible had already happened, and Richard Hawthorne stood there with the photograph in his hands, no longer the man who had issued a challenge, but someone facing the weight of a promise that had outlived his memory of it. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because there were no words, but because the right ones had to come from somewhere deeper than the surface he had relied on for years. And the girl stood across from him, steady and patient, her eyes never leaving his face, not demanding, not accusing, simply waiting, as if she had carried this moment for a long time and knew it would arrive exactly like this. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point that night, but carried farther than before because now it was real. "What is her name?" he asked, and the question did not sound like a test or a challenge. It sounded like something he should have asked a long time ago. And the girl took a small breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her backpack as if grounding herself. And then she answered, clear and certain, "Angela Brooks." And the name settled into the room with a quiet finality, and something in Richard's expression shifted again, more visibly this time, as recognition moved from uncertainty into clarity, and his grip on the photograph tightened just slightly, not out of tension, but out of connection, as if the name had completed something the image alone could not. And he nodded once. Slow and deliberate. Angela, he repeated, almost to himself, and the years between then and now seemed to close just a little more, and the girl watched him, her expression unchanged, but there was something else there now, something softer, something that acknowledged that he was finally seeing what had always been there, and Richard lifted his gaze to meet hers again. And for the first time, there was no distance in it, no barrier of status or control, just a direct, human understanding. And you are? He asked. And the question was careful, respectful, as if he already knew the answer mattered. And the girl did not hesitate, did not look away. She simply stood a little straighter beneath the chandelier light and said, Lila Brooks. And the name connected instantly, not through logic, but through something deeper, something that did not need explanation. And the room felt it, that quiet, unmistakable realization that moved through the space without a single word being spoken. And Richard's breath slowed again, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the truth settled fully into place. And he looked at her not as a stranger, not as a child who had interrupted his evening, but as someone who carried a part of story he had left behind, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete, as if everything that needed to be revealed had already been said. And after a moment, Richard took a step forward, closing the distance between them not as a command, but as a choice, and he lowered himself just slightly so that he was no longer looking down at her, but meeting her at eye level. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but different now, shaped by something that had shifted inside him. I should have come back, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had been left undone. And Lila did not interrupt, did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, but her eyes holding something that felt like both truth and possibility at the same time. And in that moment, the challenge that had started the night no longer mattered. The $1 million no longer mattered because the real exchange had already happened, something far more valuable, something that could not be measured or negotiated. And as Richard stood there, still holding the photograph, he understood for the first time that success had not erased the past. It had only delayed this moment. And now that it had arrived, there was only one thing left that mattered. Not what he had built, but what he would choose to do next.